The sun was just rising over Hancock County Regional Airport, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was a small airfield, the kind you could drive past 100 times and never really notice. A few old hangars, some vintage aircraft, and a maintenance crew that had been there longer than most people had been alive. This was home now for Major Sarah Chen, though home felt like the wrong word entirely. 3 months ago, Sarah had been a decorated pilot with the United States Air Force. She had flown combat missions, led a squadron of 20 pilots, and received commendation after commendation. She had done everything right. She had sacrificed everything right. But then came the incident over Arizona that changed everything. It wasn't her fault. The military investigation proved that. But someone needed to take the blame. Someone needed to lose their career so that higher-ranking officers could keep theirs. And that someone was Sarah Chen. Now, at 42 years old, she worked as a civilian flight instructor at this small county airport. It was a fall from grace that tasted like ashes. The pay was low. The work was routine. And almost nobody knew who she really was. She arrived early that Wednesday morning, like she always did. The crew was already there, moving around the maintenance hangar with the kind of lazy efficiency that came from doing the same work for decades. Tom was the head mechanic. He was in his 60s, with weathered hands and a face that had been carved by wind and sun. He nodded at her but didn't say much. He never said much to her. None of them did. "Morning, Sarah," he called out, not looking up from the engine he was inspecting. "Morning," she replied, heading toward the scheduling office. She kept her replies short. She had learned that people didn't want to hear from her. They wanted her to do her job quietly, without taking up space or attention. The office was cramped and cluttered. Filing cabinets lined one wall. Schedules covered a large board. A small desk held 3 computers that were at least 15 years old. Sarah set her coffee down and began opening files for the day. She had 2 students scheduled. Both were young men in their 20s. Both treated her the way most people did now, with a mix of indifference and mild disrespect. Around 9 in the morning, an old man came into the office. Sarah had seen him around the airfield before. He was tall and thin, maybe in his mid-70s. He had white hair and moved with careful precision, the way people do when their bodies have started to fail them. He always wore the same thing, old jeans, a faded flight jacket from an era nobody could quite identify, and a worn baseball cap that might have said something once but was too old to read. He never talked to anyone. He would come to the airfield, wander around, look at the planes, and leave. Sarah had assumed he was just a retired pilot who liked to come back and remember better days. She understood that feeling now. "You're the instructor?" he asked, looking directly at her. His voice was surprisingly clear and strong. "Yes," Sarah said. "Sarah Chen. Are you here about lessons?" He shook his head. "Just curious," he said. "Been coming here for a while. Noticed you. You look like someone who knows what you're doing." It was a small compliment, barely a compliment at all, but it landed on Sarah like a rare kindness. She found herself smiling slightly. "Thank you," she said. "What brings someone like you to a place like this?" he asked. Sarah's smile faded. "Just life," she said, turning back to her work. "Just life." She hoped he would leave it at that. But he didn't. "You military?" he asked, pulling up a chair. Sarah froze. She had never told anyone here about her background. She had wanted to leave it all behind. But she supposed it showed. The way she sat. The way she spoke. The bearing that 20 years in the Air Force had carved into her bones. "How did you know?" she asked quietly. "I know the look," he said simply. "Been around soldiers my whole life." He paused. "Fly?" It was a simple question, but it carried weight. Sarah nodded. She didn't want to talk about this. She didn't want to talk about the years of training, the flights, the people who had depended on her, the way it had all fallen apart. But something in the old man's eyes, some quiet understanding there, made her open up a little. "I was a pilot," she said. "Combat pilot. But that's over now." The old man nodded as if this explained everything. "Politics," he said. It wasn't a question. Sarah looked at him sharply. She hadn't said anything about politics, but he had guessed it anyway. "Yes," she admitted. "Politics." He stood up slowly, like it took effort. "Worlds full of people who remember the wrong things," he said. "And forget the right things. People like you don't fit their stories anymore. So they push you aside." He walked toward the door, then paused. "But that doesn't change what you know. That doesn't change what you can do. Don't forget that." And then he left. Sarah sat at her desk for a long time after he was gone, staring at nothing. She had spent 3 months trying to forget what she could do, trying to convince herself that that version of her was gone. But the old man had been right. You couldn't just erase a lifetime of skill and knowledge and training. It was still there, inside her, whether she wanted it to be or not. That afternoon, her first student came in. His name was Kyle, and he was the kind of young man who thought he knew everything already. He flew with sloppy technique and didn't want to hear corrections. He interrupted her constantly with his own ideas about how things should be done. Halfway through the lesson, his radio technique was getting worse instead of better. Sarah tried to explain it to him, tried to show him the right way. "Look, I know how to do this," Kyle said dismissively. "I've watched a lot of YouTube videos. I think your way is outdated." Sarah felt something shift inside her. This was the pattern. This was what her life had become. People young enough to be her children, people without a fraction of her experience, dismissing her without even listening. People forgetting what real skill looked like because they had convinced themselves that confidence was the same as competence. She said nothing. She just adjusted her headset and continued with the lesson. But she wasn't the same Sarah who had come to work that morning. The old man's words had awakened something in her. A quiet anger, yes, but also something else. A spark of something that had been dormant for 3 months. When the lesson ended, Sarah went to the break room and sat alone with her coffee. She thought about the old man and his cryptic words. She thought about how good it had felt, just for a moment, to think about flying again. Real flying. The kind that mattered. She didn't know it yet, but her life was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. And it all started with that quiet old man who showed up at the airfield on a Wednesday morning and seemed to see something in her that everyone else had forgotten to look for. Outside the window, the old man was walking across the runway, his hands in his pockets, looking up at the sky. Over the next 2 weeks, the old man became a regular at the airfield. He would come in the mornings, sometimes early, sometimes later in the day. He never formally introduced himself, and Sarah never asked his name. There was something about him that existed outside of normal social requirements. He was just there, like part of the landscape. He would sit in the office and read old aviation magazines, or he would walk out to the hangars and look at the planes. Tom, the head mechanic, would sometimes talk to him. They seemed to know each other, though Sarah couldn't figure out how. What surprised her most was that the old man seemed genuinely interested in her work. When she was preparing for lessons, he would watch. When she was reviewing flight plans, he would sit nearby and occasionally ask a question. His questions were always smart. They weren't the questions of someone just making conversation. They were the questions of someone who understood flying at a deep level. One afternoon, after a particularly frustrating lesson with Kyle and another student named Marcus, Sarah found herself talking to him more openly than she had talked to anyone since her discharge. "They don't respect anything," she said, more frustrated than she intended to sound. "They think because they've watched videos and they're young and confident, that means they know something. They don't. They have no idea what they don't know." The old man was looking at one of the planes out the window, a Cessna 172, the most reliable training aircraft ever built. "You're angry," he said. It wasn't a criticism. It was an observation. "Yes," Sarah admitted. "I'm angry. And I'm tired. I'm tired of being invisible to people who need my help. I'm tired of working at a fraction of my capacity just to pay the rent. I'm tired of..." She stopped. She had already said too much. The old man turned to look at her. "You want to tell me what happened? The real story, not the public version?" Sarah should have said no. She should have kept her distance. But she was so tired of keeping secrets, so tired of swallowing the injustice of it all, that she found herself telling him everything. She told him about the mission in Arizona. A bombing run near the border. Sarah was the flight lead. Her instruments showed a clear bombing zone, no civilian presence, clear authorization from ground control. She ordered the strike. 20 minutes later, they found out that the GPS coordinates had been wrong. Terribly wrong. There had been civilians in the building. 7 of them. 2 children. Sarah had replayed that moment 1,000 times. She had run every possible scenario through her mind. The instruments were military grade. The information came from command. The protocols had been followed exactly. There had been no way for her to know. No way at all. But someone had needed to be responsible. The higher-ranking officers who authorized the strike remained in their positions. The intelligence officers who gave the wrong coordinates kept their clearances. But Sarah, the pilot who had actually executed the order, Sarah became the problem that needed to be solved. The military investigation cleared her. It wasn't her fault. But the public relations disaster was immense. So they offered her a choice: take a dishonorable discharge and sign an agreement not to speak publicly, or face a court-martial that would take years and destroy everything anyway. Sarah had taken the first option. She had signed away her career, her identity, and her voice. When she finished the story, she was shaking. The old man didn't say anything. For a long time. He just looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That wasn't justice," he finally said. "No," Sarah agreed. "It wasn't. And those officers who were responsible, they're still giving orders." "Probably," Sarah said. I try not to think about it. The old man stood up and walked to the window. He stood there for a long time. Looking out at the runway, his hands clasped behind his back. You know what I notice, he said finally. I notice that they took your voice. They took your career. But they couldn't take what you know. They couldn't take your skill. They couldn't take your integrity. Those things are still yours. They always will be. Sarah didn't respond. She wanted to believe him, but the sting of it all was still too fresh. That same week, something unexpected happened. Tom, the head mechanic, came to Sarah with a problem. One of the planes in the hangar, a beautiful old Beechcraft Bonanza that belonged to a private collector, was having electrical issues. They couldn't figure out what was wrong. Tom had been working on it for 3 days. Without success. Could you take a look? He asked Sarah. You know more about electrical systems than anyone here. It was the first time in 3 months that anyone had asked her for real help. Not instruction. Not just teaching a lesson. Real, technical help. Sarah spent 2 hours going through the plane systems. She found the problem. Quickly, a small corroded connector in an unusual location that the previous mechanic had missed. It was the kind of thing you only found if you knew what to look for. If you had spent years learning to troubleshoot complex systems. Tom was amazed. How did you find that? He asked. Experience, Sarah said simply. I've spent a lot of time in the guts of aircraft. Tom nodded thoughtfully. He didn't know the full story, but Sarah had a feeling he suspected there was more to her background than she had revealed. Over the next few days, Tom started asking her advice on other mechanical issues. He treated her differently after that, with respect. As if he had suddenly realized that she wasn't just another flight instructor, but someone who actually knew things. The old man noticed. See, he said one afternoon. You fix one thing, and people start to remember who you actually are. Sarah was about to respond when her phone buzzed. It was an email notification. She opened it and felt her blood run cold. It was from a journalist. Someone had leaked the full file from her case. The details of what happened in Arizona. The names of the officers involved. The cover-up. All of it was about to become public. Sarah's hands were shaking. This was what she had feared. This was why she had signed that agreement to keep quiet. Because she knew the truth would come out. Eventually, and when it did, there would be consequences. For her. For the officers. For everyone involved. The old man saw her face and came over. What happened? He asked. Sarah told him about the email, about the leak, about the fact that her silence was about to become meaningless anyway. The old man was quiet. Then he said something that made Sarah look at him with new understanding. Sometimes a secret that was wrong to keep needs to be told. No matter the cost. That's when you find out who you really are. Sarah looked at the old man more carefully than she had before. There was something in the way he spoke about secrets, about truth, about finding out who you really are. Something personal. Something like he was speaking from experience. Who are you? She asked suddenly. I mean, who are you really? The old man smiled. It was the first real smile she had seen from him. Someone who knows what it's like to lose everything for telling the truth, he said. And someone who knows what it's like to eventually win it back. But before Sarah could ask what he meant, the old man stood up. I should go, he said. But Sarah, get ready. Things are about to change. And when they do, you're going to need to be braver than you've ever been. He left the office, and Sarah was alone with her phone, the email, and the feeling that her entire life was about to be turned upside down. The story broke on a Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, Sarah's small apartment was surrounded by news vans. By Friday evening, her phone was ringing constantly. From journalists, lawyers, and people claiming to be her supporters. The leaked file had included everything. The names of the officers who falsified reports to cover their mistakes. The pressure that had been put on Sarah to take the fall. The way the military investigation had been quietly closed after she signed the discharge agreement. All of it was public now. Sarah didn't answer the calls. She sat in her apartment, watching her face appear on news broadcasts, watching reporters stand in front of the airfield, talking about a decorated pilot who had been betrayed by the system that created her. Her phone rang again. This time it was a lawyer from a major firm. They specialized in military cases, the voice on the other end said. They had been following her situation. They wanted to represent her. There would be no fee. They saw this as a matter of principle. Sarah wanted to laugh at the word principle. She had learned what principle cost over the past 3 months. It cost your career. It cost your identity. It cost you everything. But then she thought about the old man's words. About finding out who you really are. Saturday morning, Sarah did something she had avoided for months. She drove to the airfield. She knew the press would likely follow her, and they did. But the airfield was private property, and Tom turned the news vans away at the gate. Sarah found herself in the small office, surrounded by the ordinary quiet that had become her life. Tom was there. A couple of mechanics were working in the hangar. And sitting in the corner, reading an old aviation magazine like nothing unusual was happening, was the old man. I was wondering when you would come, he said, looking up from his magazine. Did you know? Sarah asked. Did you know this was going to happen? The old man folded his magazine carefully. I knew it was possible, he said. I knew the truth couldn't stay buried forever. I knew that when you stopped being silent, other people would stop being silent too. Sarah wanted to be angry at him. She wanted to tell him that he had somehow orchestrated this, that he had known and had done nothing to warn her. But she couldn't. Because something in her knew that he was right. The truth had a weight to it. It pressed and pressed until eventually something gave way. What happens now? She asked, sitting down heavily. That depends on you, the old man said. You could take the settlement the military will inevitably offer. They'll reinstate your rank. They'll give you back pay. They'll apologize. And they'll make you sign another agreement, promising not to talk about it publicly. The officers responsible will get slapped on the wrist. Their careers will continue. And the whole thing will be safely forgotten by next year. Sarah thought about that. It was the safer path. The more comfortable path. Or, she said, knowing there had to be more. Or you tell the whole story, the old man said. You give testimony. You become a public advocate for changing the system. You make sure this doesn't happen to someone else. You make sure those officers face real consequences. You do what's right, even though it will be harder and scarier and will take years. Sarah looked at him. You're describing a path that destroys my life. No, the old man said quietly. You destroy your life when you run from the truth. When you hide who you are. When you let other people make you small. You rebuild your life when you stand up and claim what's yours. When you tell the truth. When you become the person you were always meant to be. He stood up and walked toward the window. Sarah followed him. They stood there together, looking out at the runway and the planes beyond it. I'm going to tell you something, the old man said. Something I haven't told anyone in a very long time. I was a pilot too. Just like you. I flew for the military. I flew in combat. I was good at it. Better than good. I was the best. Sarah listened. She hadn't expected him to open up. In 1992, I was ordered to do something I knew was wrong. Not a mistake. Not a gray area. Actually, genuinely wrong. Dangerous to innocent people. I refused the order. And I reported it up the chain. He paused. That was a mistake. I learned very quickly that the system doesn't reward you for being right. It punishes you for being inconvenient. He turned to look at Sarah. I lost my career. I lost my security clearance. I lost my identity as a pilot. I spent decades believing that I had thrown it all away for nothing. That the truth hadn't mattered. That nobody cared about what I had sacrificed. What changed? Sarah asked. Time, he said. And eventually, justice. It took 20 years. It took congressional hearings. It took other people having the courage to speak up. But eventually, the truth came out. And there was this moment, this single moment. When I was finally vindicated. When everyone who had treated me like I was wrong suddenly had to admit that I had been right all along. He looked back out the window. I've lived a quiet life since then. I don't talk about what happened. I come here to the airfield because planes are the only thing that never betrayed me. They do what they're designed to do. They follow the laws of physics. They don't lie. Sarah understood then. This old man wasn't just a random stranger who had wandered into her life. He was something else entirely. He was a mirror. He was proof that survival after betrayal was possible. That you could lose everything. And eventually find yourself again. What's your name? Sarah asked suddenly. I should know your name. The old man smiled. It's Robert, he said. Robert Hayes. And I was the test pilot who exposed the flaw in the F-15 avionics system that caused 17 crashes before it was fixed. I was also the person who the Air Force blamed for speaking publicly about it. Sarah nodded slowly. She had heard of the F-15 avionics scandal. Everyone in aviation knew about it. It was taught in training courses as an example of why integrity in maintenance and testing was so important. I didn't know that person was still alive, Sarah said. Most people don't, Robert said. I prefer it that way. I did my part. Now I'm just an old man who loves planes and watches the new generation figure out the same hard lessons I did. He paused. Until I met you. Then I started thinking maybe it was time to do something else. Maybe it was time to help someone else face the same choice I faced. A sound came from outside, news reporters calling her name, pressing against the fence. The circus of it all was still happening out there. You don't have to decide anything today, Robert said. But Sarah? When you do decide, make sure it's the decision you can live with for the rest of your life. Because that's the only decision that actually matters. The next 4 months were the hardest of Sarah's life. Harder than boot camp. Harder than her first combat mission. Harder than the day she received her discharge papers. She hired the legal team. She gave depositions. She sat in rooms with lawyers from the Air Force, watching them try to minimize what had happened, watching them use language to twist the truth into something less damaging. But Sarah didn't flinch. She had spent 3 months learning how to be quiet. Now she was learning how to be loud. She testified before a special committee of Congress. She brought documentation. She brought the names of people who had warned her that the operation was compromised. She brought the evidence that the officers involved had known about the intelligence failure and had moved forward anyway. And then she did something that almost no military person ever does. She went public. Not just with interviews, but with a book. She hired a ghostwriter and spent 6 months telling the whole story. All of it. The book was called Invisible Pilot: How the Military Silenced the Truth. It sold well. It got attention from major news outlets. It sparked conversations about military accountability and the systems that punish integrity instead of rewarding it. Sarah's face was everywhere. The woman who had spoken up. The woman who had risked everything. The woman who had refused to stay silent. Some people praised her as a hero. Others called her a traitor. Both sides were loud. Both sides were certain. Sarah moved through the noise with the kind of focus she had learned in combat. She didn't let the praise make her sloppy. She didn't let the criticism make her doubt. What kept her steady was Robert. He came to the airfield less often now. Age was catching up with him, but when he did come, they would sit in the office and talk about everything. "How do you live with having changed things?" Sarah asked him once. She was thinking about the lives affected by her testimony. The officers who were facing investigation. The families of the civilians who had died, who now had someone to blame. "How do you live with stirring all of this up?" "You live with it by knowing that silence would have been worse," Robert said. "I could have stayed quiet. I could have accepted the cover-up. And other planes would have crashed. Other pilots would have died. Other families would have lost someone. My silence would have killed people. At least my truth gave people the information they needed to decide." Sarah understood what he meant. She had spent weeks going through the aftermath of her testimony, looking at the damage, sometimes wondering if she had made a mistake. But then she would remember what Robert had said: silence would have been worse. 6 months after she went public, something remarkable happened. 3 of the 4 officers who had been involved in the decision to carry out the bombing run were forced to resign. The investigation into military protocol led to changes in how intelligence was verified before strikes were authorized. Congress held hearings. The Secretary of Defense called for reform. And the military offered Sarah her commission back. Full reinstatement. All back. Pay, plus interest. An apology. A request that she come back to active duty. Sarah read the formal letter 3 times before showing it to Robert. "Are you going to say yes?" he asked. Sarah looked at the letter. It represented everything she had lost. Everything. She had been fighting to get back. 3 months ago, she would have said yes. Immediately. But something had changed in her during those months of fighting. The anger was still there, but it had transformed into something else. It had become purpose. "I don't think so," Sarah said. "I think I'm going to do something different." She called the lawyer. She called the news outlets. She made an announcement. That shocked most people. She was turning down reinstatement. Instead, she was accepting a position with a new military reform organization. The group worked to advocate for changes in military protocol, to support whistleblowers, to ensure that the system protected integrity instead of punishing it. She would make less money. She would lose the security of a military career. But she would have something else. She would have the ability to help others facing the same choice she had faced. She would have the ability to make sure the system changed. It was the opposite of the safe choice. But it was the right choice. Robert smiled when she told him what she had decided. That's exactly what you should do, he said. You know why? Because you've learned the most important lesson. You've learned that you matter more than your career. That your integrity matters more than your rank. That helping people matters more than helping yourself. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened at the airfield. Sarah was in the office when Tom came to find her. He looked excited about something. There's someone here to see you, Tom said. A man. Says he knows you. Says. It's about flying. Sarah was confused. She wasn't expecting anyone. She went out to the front area and found a younger man, maybe in his 50s, standing by the window looking at the planes. Major Chen, he said, turning to face her. My name is David Torres. I'm a congressman. I've been reading your book. I've been following your case. Sarah shook his hand, still confused about why he was here. I'm here to ask you something, David said. I'm proposing legislation to establish a permanent position within the Air Force. A position dedicated to ensuring that whistleblowers and personnel who report problems are protected instead of punished. I want you to advise on it. I want your voice in helping design it. Sarah couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. This was bigger than her own case. This was about creating lasting change. I would be honored, she said. As David left, explaining that his team would be in touch, Sarah looked back toward where Robert usually sat. But Robert wasn't there. Tom mentioned that he hadn't seen Robert all week. Sarah felt a flutter of concern. She had come to count on his quiet presence. She had come to think of him as something permanent in her life, like the planes themselves. She didn't know then that Robert's absence would become the final piece of her story. The piece that would complete her understanding of who he was and why he had come into her life exactly when she needed him. Robert didn't come back to the airfield that week. Or the next week. Sarah told herself he was probably just tired, that he was probably resting at home, that it didn't mean anything. But she knew better. 3 weeks later, Sarah got a call from Tom. Robert had died. A heart attack. Quiet. Peaceful. It had happened in his sleep. The funeral was small. Sarah attended, along with Tom and a few other people who had known Robert over the years. An old woman who might have been his sister. A man who claimed to have flown with him decades ago. A handful of others scattered through the small church, each one carrying their own memories of a quiet old man who had never asked for attention. After the service, an elderly woman approached Sarah. She introduced herself as Robert's sister, Margaret. He talked about you, Margaret said. Near the end. He said he was grateful. He got to meet you. He said it reminded him why it all mattered. Why he had sacrificed what he sacrificed. Sarah didn't know what to say. She had thought Robert was just a stranger who had wandered into her life. She hadn't realized how much their conversations had affected him. He left you something, Margaret said, handing Sarah an envelope. It was thick. And heavy. He gave it to me 6 months ago. He said to give it to you when he was gone. He said you would know when you needed it. Sarah held the envelope, not opening it yet. Why did he help me? She asked. Margaret smiled sadly. Because he couldn't help himself when he needed it, she said. Because he spent 50 years living quietly, and he realized before he died that quiet had its place, but so did speaking up. He wanted to make sure that the next person who faced the choice he faced would know they didn't have to suffer alone. That there was someone who understood. That there was a witness. Sarah opened the envelope after she got home. Inside was a letter, written in careful handwriting. Dear Sarah, it began. If you're reading this, then I'm gone. I won't be at the airfield anymore to drink coffee and watch the planes. But I want you to know something. I want you to know why I came to the airfield that day when you were there. The truth is, I had been coming to that airfield for 5 years before I met you. I came because I needed to be around planes. Because I needed to remember who I had been before everything fell apart. I was just an old man going through the motions, going through the days, waiting for the end. Then you arrived. And I saw myself in you. I saw the anger. I saw the resignation. I saw the way you had stopped believing that you mattered. I had been that person. I knew exactly what that felt like. I didn't orchestrate what happened with the leak of your file. That was real. That was the universe deciding it was time for the truth to come out. But I knew when it happened that this was your moment. This was the moment you would have to choose between staying small and standing tall. I am writing to you now as proof. As proof that you can survive it. As proof that the cost of the truth is worth paying. I spent 50 years not believing that. I spent 50 years thinking I had made a mistake. But in these last few months, watching you find your voice, watching you decide to dedicate your life to helping others, I finally understood that I hadn't made a mistake. I had made a choice. And that choice, difficult as it was, had allowed me to be the person you needed me to be. The life I lived was quieter than I ever planned. But it was honest. And at the end, when I was lying awake at 3 a.m. thinking about my life, I was glad. I was glad that I had spoken truth, even though it cost me everything. Because the alternative, staying silent, accepting the lie, becoming complicit, that would have been a life I couldn't live. I hope you are brave enough to choose the hard path. I hope you keep speaking truth. And I hope that somewhere down the line, when you meet someone who is facing the same choice you faced, you remember me, and you pass on what I've tried to pass on to you. Which is simply this: you matter. Your integrity matters. The truth matters. And you are capable of enduring far more than you think you can. Fly well, Sarah. Keep your altitude true and your heading steady. Robert Hayes. Sarah read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in a frame. She hung it in her office, where she would see it every morning. A reminder of what Robert had sacrificed. A reminder of why her own sacrifice was worth it. 2 years later, Sarah stood in a congressional hearing room. The legislation she had helped design was about to be voted on. The Whistleblower Protection and Integrity Act. It had Robert's fingerprints all over it, though his name would never appear in the legislation. The vote was overwhelming. The bill passed 412 to 23. Major changes were coming to how the military handled people who reported problems. There would be protections. There would be oversight. There would be consequences for leaders who tried to cover up problems instead of fixing them. That evening, Sarah went back to the airfield. She hadn't worked there in over a year, but the place still felt like home. Tom was still there, still working on planes, still bringing order to the chaos of mechanical systems. Sarah walked out to the runway and just stood there, watching the evening light paint the sky in shades of gold and red. She thought about Robert. About his 50 years of quiet. About his decision, near the end of his life, to speak up one more time. About the way he had given her the courage to do the same. She thought about the young pilot who had been discharged last month after refusing an order she knew was wrong. Sarah had met with her. She had told her about Robert. She had told her that the sacrifice would be worth it. That the truth always mattered, even when it cost you everything. Sarah pulled out her phone and called David Torres, the congressman who had supported the legislation. "I want to establish a scholarship," Sarah said, "in Robert Hayes's name. For military personnel who have been discharged for standing up for the truth. We should make sure that choosing integrity doesn't mean choosing poverty." "That's a wonderful idea," David said. "I'll help you set it up." As Sarah ended the call, she looked up at the sky. Somewhere up there, planes were flying through the darkness. Pilots were making decisions. Officers were giving orders. The vast machinery of the military was turning, just as it always did. But now there was something different. Now there were protections. Now there was a system that was a little bit more likely to listen to people who spoke truth. Now there were paths for people to speak up without destroying themselves completely. It wasn't perfect. The system still bent toward cover-ups and self-protection. But it was better. And it was better because Sarah had chosen the hard path. Because Robert had shown her that it was possible. Because two people had decided that integrity mattered more than comfort. The last plane took off from the airfield just before sunset. Sarah watched it rise into the sky, climbing steady and true, heading toward whatever destination awaited it. She thought about Robert's final words to her. "Fly well, Sarah. Keep your altitude true and your heading steady." She had done that. She would continue to do that. Not in a plane, though she still trained pilots and still loved flying. But in her life. In her choices. In her decision to keep telling the truth, even when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Two figures stood in the shadows of the hangar, watching Sarah. It was Tom and the young pilot Sarah had mentored. Tom had taken the young woman under his wing, teaching her about aircraft maintenance. Teaching her the systems. Teaching her that there was honor in the work, whether you wore a uniform or not. "She's going to do great things," the young pilot said. "She already has," Tom replied. "She just didn't know it yet." And on the quiet airfield in the middle of America, as the sun set and the sky filled with stars, Sarah Chen stood alone with her thoughts and her memories and her hope for a better future. A future that Robert Hayes had helped her believe in.